Welcome to Level with Emily Reese. This is music by composer Brad Gentle for the game No Way Home, which is a space shooter on Apple Arcade from a studio called SMG Studio. Brad also helps out with the levelwithemily.com website, YouTube channel, and more, so he's always listed in the credits at the end of every episode. But Brad is a composer. He's worked on several games with SMG Studio, which is located in Australia, including Death Squared. On No Way Home, this newest title from Brad and SMG Studio, I really loved the variety in the score, and especially loved the ambient tracks, and was really surprised and tickled to learn that Brad used recordings of planets from NASA on some of those ambi tracks, which was really fun. Here's Brad.
Really, it's a space opera set in a bullet hell type world where you're the captain of a cruise liner in space, and you get in trouble when the ship gets frozen for millions of years, and then it finally blows up, and you're basically the only one that survives, and you've got an AI helper who helps you try and find your way home, hence the name No Way Home. Yeah, so it's a bunch of fun. You have to fly around shooting guys and killing guys, but it's a lot about story. There's a real deep, rich sort of storyline that has a bit of mystery involved in it and a bit of comedy. It's very, very funny.
Tell me about the idea of it being a space opera and like what that meant for you musically as the composer.
I felt like it needed to be somewhat big, epic, but at the same time quirky because of the game's art style is really strange. It's very not quite Futurama-y type, but like very janky. In the art, it's a really cool, really cool art style.
Yes,
there's heaps of races of characters. There's like rich history that they've written for it, and musically, it meant that I could explore a lot of different genres of music as well. There was a title track that I started doing to start with, and it was much more calm and brooding sort of sounding, and then they changed the key art like sort of halfway through the process, and I was like, well, that's not going to work. We're going to have to change that a lot. So I kind of ended up going for like a real Wrath of Khan type sounding intro piece. I was like, this is really fun. I've always wanted to do some kind of massive space opera type, sounding piece, and I never really get to the opportunity to do that kind of big pompous orchestra sound, so this was a really good opportunity to go, yes, let's dig into it and make something a little bit crazy.
Yeah, I loved just kind of the variety of music, and like the jazzy stuff is super fun, and there's kind of some loungy kind of music, but there's also really great like ambient, thoughtful music. There's a really beautiful piece with cello at the end, just so much variety. So talk to me a little bit about that aspect of writing the music.
It was funny because it started out, the developers wanted to have more of like a post-rock type feel to it. And I was when I saw the artwork and had seen some of the early gameplay, I was like, don't know if it's going to work for post-rock. Kind of, it seems a bit too slick for how silly the artwork is and for how much comedy there is in the game. So I kind of was pushing for more sort of really, really weird and crazy stuff, and then they kind of met me halfway. But a lot of the jazzy sort of stuff was dictated by the storyline. So the AI character that helps you along the way, he is a fan of jazz, but he's never heard jazz because he's an AI character that's, that's set in in the distant future. And so he's always had this longing for whatever jazz was. So he's, somehow along the line has gotten MIDI files or things like that and sort of interpreted them himself. So I kind of had this idea of kind of doing a parody of jazz, but in a kind of almost like a pastiche way, like not in an insincere way. Kind of like I like the idea of jazz when someone likes the idea of jazz, but it kind of has this idea of what they think jazz sounds like.
Yeah.
So it's kind of has this a little bit digital quality because it's him manifesting this into reality, but at the same time, he's learnt well. It's kind of like if Google AI was learning how to do jazz, and you kind of go, yeah, you kind of got it, buddy. That's pretty good, I guess. So yeah, that's how the kind of jazz stuff came about, which was good because it really was good to have different aspects come through in the soundtrack. So there was I really wanted to make sure that there was that orchestral feel to it in parts when the gravitas of the situations were warranting it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's a bit silly. The storyline's a bit silly, so I kind of wanted to make sure that came across as well. So having the juxtaposition of the silly, almost jazz / lounge music, and the orchestral stuff really, really coming through, they kind of played off each other a fair bit.
The space vacation tracks are really great and satisfying. Talk to me about that tune and then getting to kind of adapt it.
Yeah, so the first one was, it was originally starting out as a 30-second video commercial for the game, sort of, and it was based on like, hey, come and do this space vacation, blah blah blah, and then during the filming of it, all these things go wrong. And then the game sort of starts from that, because you're on a cruise ship going through this intergalactic space cruise. I think it's 5 days or a couple of days cruise, kind of like the idea of Gilligan's Island type thing.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted to have that a little bit of Love Boat-ish sort of elevator music-y sort of stuff to go through it. And then, it sort of goes into to a sort of electronic version of it where it sort of starts to stutter and things start to go wrong, and then, and then it explodes. And then later on, it's kind of like when we revisit it, it's kind of almost like the music's been going in the background in some kind of music reproduction unit floating in space.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of still ticking away with this almost lounge music type sound. And it's just, sitting there on an asteroid somewhere, still trying to make its music.
Well, let's talk about the studio for just a minute, and then we'll come back to music, because you've worked with SMG Studio before. So talk to me about just the team there and your relationship with that studio, and talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, so I actually met those guys in about 2012 or something like that, when I did a game jam just when I was still trying to get into game music. And I ended up doing a game jam in Sydney. It was the Global Game Jam. And I ended up just bumping into them. I'm a bit of a chatterbox when it comes to social situations. As far as a lot of game developers go, sometimes they're a little bit more reserved than our as audio folk. So I ended up chatting their ear off. And I ended up doing a project with them for a game jam, and I think I won best audio and best game for it or something at the time. And it was just a lot of fun. We got on really well, and then a couple of months later, they were saying, "Hey, we're doing a game. Do you wanna come and do some sounds for us?" So it's just some sound effects to start with, and then I ended up doing a game called Over the Top Tower Defense with them, which was another silly kind of tower defense game that they did. And then flash forward a few years, ended up doing another game jam with Pat, one of the lead developers for there, and we ended up making Death Squared as a prototype. That ended up just being like a project that he was doing at the time, and then they had no inkling that they would make it into a full title. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, from a couple of months later, again, hey, we're doing this thing for PC and Xbox and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'll definitely do the music for that. So I ended up doing, about half an hour worth of music for them for that as well. So it's just been an ongoing relationship, just helping them out here and there. And yeah, it's great. It's good because there's not that many big-ish studios in Australia, so I just feel really lucky to have been able to get in with those guys.
So you mentioned that you did sound for them too. Did you do the sound for No Way Home as well?
I started out, it was just supposed to be music, and then a few months into the game, the sound designer who actually was supposed to sign on to do it pulled out. I think he was from Sweden or something and had some family problems or something. So they asked me if I wanted to do sound as well, and I said, yeah, that's cool, that's fine. I looked at the amount of sound that we had to do, and it was reasonable. But then we had a big scope increase, which was great. They got a lot more funding for it, and they were like, we want to do a lot more with it. This is what we're able to do. So then we ended up, I think there's like at least 150 different guns in the game.
Yes.
And so it just like grew exponentially, and it just ended up being like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get all this sort of all the music. I mean, I think there's ended up being an hour of music on the game, plus I think there's about 2 more hours in the can.
Wow.
It was a lot. We did a lot of music for it. So yeah, we ended up getting Stafford Bowler on from I think he'd done Monument Valley.
Nice.
A bunch of other games. Yeah, he's really good. And I left him this massive mess to deal with because I was sort of halfway through it when I was like, hey, I don't think I'm going to get it all done in time. So we got him on board to help out with the sound effects. So he sort of finished it off. So I kind of ended up doing a lot of the setup and getting a soundscape for it, a
Nice.
palette. And then it was like, okay, do this because I'm not even going to get close to finishing it. Yeah, it ended up being really like a lot of sound for the game. It was amazing.
When you've done sound design in the past, I mean, do you enjoy it as much as doing music? I mean, is it kind of a similar creation process for you, or what?
Yeah, I find the sound design stuff, I think they go hand in hand a fair bit, because, I mean, you can sort of influence the sound effects by the music, and vice versa. You could have a certain type of sound for the sound effects and then use those kind of sounds in the music, or actually do exactly the opposite of those things so that the sound effects really stand out. You know, if you've got some really short, chippy, choppy sounds, you know, for the sound effects, then they really sit on top of sort of more of a like an organic sort of sounding soundtrack. So you can have this real juxtaposition between what the sound effects are doing, so that you can get those really pertinent sounds sticking out over top of the sound. But it just depends on what the project is anyway. Yeah, the sound effects, it's all in the same kind of programs, and you spend a lot of time tinkering with things. But I mean, you know, it's up to each individual person how they sort of implement things.
Yeah.
It's difficult to sort of put your finger on what a good sound design is, because I mean, something that sometimes you listen to some sound effects from games and you're like, I would never have done that, but that works really well. Yeah. The ambient parts of the soundtrack were interesting, because that almost works out the way that the sound effects work for me. I spend probably more time creating the right presets than I do writing the songs for the ambient stuff, because the ambient stuff almost like writes itself once you've got the sounds set up for it.
Sure.
So you feel your way through some of the things. You're like, oh, you know, you're playing sort of similar chords to you do that in other parts of the more structured pieces. But because a lot of the time they've got like 30 delays and different ambiences, then they end up writing themselves. I actually used NASA recordings of some of the planets and made pads out of them. Yeah, so I got some of the recordings from some of the NASA recordings of I think it's like there's some Ganymede and like a bunch of all these different planet sounds, and there's sort of basically like a pad sound, and then I just get them and make sort of sometimes make some organish sort of sounds out of them, or dynamically sensitive ones. So the harder you hit it, the quicker the attack is, and all that sort of stuff. So you can sort of play the space sounds as an instrument.
Nice.
Yeah, there's a couple of black hole recordings. Yeah, so I've just found that was a really interesting way of bringing the space elements into the game musically.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the time you use musical elements as sound effects, but not a lot of the time you use sound effects as music.
One of the ethereal tracks that I really liked, and maybe this isn't necessarily an ambi track, but it was much more ethereal than some of the other tunes, is right away in the beginning, called Asteroids Everywhere. And I really loved that track. I loved the reverb kind of makes it just like this big, giant space, literally, right? So tell me about that tune.
Yeah, that was really fun. That was a bunch of different synths and a bunch of different... That was actually some of the NASA recording stuff.
Nice.
Used as pads. But yeah, I kind of went through and basically probably played for like half an hour. I just improvised for about half an hour on that. And then I kind of have an idea, and like I'll be listening to it back and saying, oh, I liked that kind of that 20 seconds. That was really cool. So I'll, cut that out and put it on the side. And then do the same thing, 5 minutes later. Oh, that part really stuck out as being something really cool, so I'll put that on the side as well. And then, pretty much throw everything out that isn't part of the process, part of the good bits.
Yeah.
And then with that, kind of refine it a bit and actually play those bits on purpose, and then sort of stitch it together in a way that makes sense so that it's interesting, second to second. It's kind of, it is ambient and it is a long track, but each sort of section stands alone vertically. You can hear, you can sort of hear little bits and pieces that are interesting, but it's kind of, it's very flowing. And the reason it sounds more ambient than it is that it is so disparate. It's written half an hour away from each other, but then sort of squashed together into this 2-minute track or 3-minute track, whatever it is. And there's kind of random elements to it as well, where I'll have 5 or 6 different instruments that I know that I want that line to be played on, and then I can have a randomization thing where I'll be playing the MIDI keys, like actually playing the song, but the computer will decide which instrument it's playing on at that point in time. So depending on, the way I heard it when I was playing it is actually probably different to when it got bounced out, because the randomization actually happens at runtime. So it's different every time you press play. So, I think I bounced out maybe 3 or 4 times before actually locking in on going, that's the version that I like the best.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I did that a lot in Death Squared as well, sort of, write the song and then let the computers decide, because very computer oriented sort of game design anyway. So that was how I came across that sort of sound.
There's a track called Good Intentions, and I love all the arpeggiating synths in there. It's the only track that I was like, oh, that sounds like X. You know what I mean? And it reminded me of Portal and Portal 2. So talk to me about Good Intentions.
Yes. And I do totally see what you mean about that. Yeah, that's a shepherd tone. That's based around a shepherd tone, where as the tone goes down, and the higher up octave of that same note will come in and overtake it. The note will always go down or up. I think Hans Zimmer uses it in Dunkirk or something as well as an example. But basically, if you're going up an octave, as you're going up through a tone, the lower octave of that tone comes up in volume as the main one that you're going up in goes down in volume. So then by the time you get back up to that first note, they're at the same volume again. Okay. So then if you have 3 octaves and you go up or down in my case, then they kind of almost just overlay each other, so that you don't really, it kind of feels like it's always going down. Yeah. Even though you actually are listening to the same octave over and over, which is really strange. Yeah, but that was the idea, and it was actually a lot faster to start with. But then I ended up pulling it down and making it a bit more ethereal and chucking some effects on it and stuff like that. But that I can tell what you mean now that you've said that. I'm like, that does feel like a Mike sort of thing.
tell me about, there's this really sad track at the end. I'm sure you already know which one I'm talking about. Listen and Listen Fast. Tell me about that one.
Yeah, so that's sort of a calm before the storm type sound, where there's some revelations happening, and that actually started out as the basis for the original title track. So it was kind of like this full circle thing for us, where it started out being this hopeful thing, and then now it's kind of like this, is there any way we're getting out of this alive kind of thing, and it feels serious rather than the rest of the game sort of feels a little bit flippant and a little bit like comical and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I kind of wanted to make sure that was real. That was sort of, you could hear that in proper serious video game, you know.
I also loved Squeegee's Arcade. Just took me back to the 80s, so talk about that one.
Yeah, that was some for DLC actually, because they ended up doing an element of DLC that you could go into his arcade, and he's like a child of the 80s.
Nice.
But it's like the 2,865,080s rather than the 1980s sort of thing. And, you know, as music goes full circle.
Yeah, I love that.
It's
oh
basically,
my God.
it lands in the same sort of decade. Yeah, and so I wanted to make sure that there was some 80s, and because they were really interested in the post-rock and synthwavey sort of stuff to start with, I was like, okay, this is cool, because, you know, and I'd been in the same world as doing 80s stuff at pretty much at the same time, because I ended up doing another game for them, doing some DLC for them for a game called Moving Out, and that is based in 80s themes. I think the guy from Transformers that wrote the Transformers theme song worked on the original game, and so I ended up doing the DLC stuff for it, and so I was in that sort of 80s zone of doing, you know, Miami and, you know, Hawaii. 80s sort of sounding music, theme song to Full House and that kind of feel. So that was a given. I was like, well, I'm definitely going to go for some kind of 80s arcade music. And for a lot of the inside the game elements, where you're in a shop or anything like that, I ended up using a binaural plugin so that it makes it sound like you're in the game, you're in that space with them.
Yeah.
So sort of the jazz stuff in a bar, I've actually chucked in some binaural plugin stuff so that it sounds like the music is coming from a certain spot in the scene. So you kind of have that kind of like immersion part, even because the game's 2D. There was no sort of 3D elements to the game world, so like for the sound anyway. And so I thought, instead of having it just as a 2D sort of sounding jazz, I was like, let's make sure that it actually sounds like it is in 3D space, even if you're only in a 2D world. So that's how those kind of in the game sort of sounds happened, and that was how that happened in Squeegee's Arcade. And so I ended up doing a version where the arcade was closed, when the arcade was open, and then when you're actually in the game playing the game itself, so like playing an arcade game itself.
Yeah.
And the one that's in the soundtrack is sort of a mix of all those three. I wanted to do a bit more of that sort of stuff, but there wasn't kind of warranted. But I was like, I have like 5 more tracks I've got ready for this thing, but it's like, where are they going to go? I don't know.
Talk to me about some of the instruments that you ended up using to make the music.
Well, yeah, besides all the pads and stuff that I used from the space, the recordings and stuff, I ended up recording a bunch of just stuff around the house. I've got a big metal vinyls case that I've got here. It's like an old chest, and like, you know, banging on that for some drums and scraping on things. I had some Darcy, my son's musical kids instruments. There was like glockenspiels and things like that. He has a thing called a gasong, which is like basically a hang drum, but a kind of a different way of making a hang drum that I ended up using for a bunch of stuff and pitching it down. And I've got some rain sticks and didgeridoo. There's a bunch of stuff that we've got here that I just ended up banging and clanging on to make stuff, pots and pans, because a lot of the elements of the percussion was it's to sound like the post-apocalyptic kind of space sound that you see in the game. There's a lot of outposts for really. There's a race called the Primal, and there's a race called the Rustbloods. So I wanted to make sure that those guys had this really gross old sounding things, you know, shutting doors and all that sort of stuff. Actually had an old typewriter that I used for Bureaucrabs theme. So it's kind of, because they're the Bureaucrabs.
Nice.
They're the crabs, and they're bureaucratic crabs that make it, you know. Yeah, and so some of the percussion for that was a typewriter, so it was kind of like they're always very serious and very, you know, but they're a very neutral race in the game. They're sort of not good nor bad. They're very much the in-betweeners. So yeah, they have typewriters and paper sounds and things like that in there, that, like, you know, scrunching up paper is a part of it, and ripping paper and stamping things. Yeah, so I kind of had just a lot of messing around with stuff to try and work out what kind of instrument palette we wanted to do, and that, I think that comes across in the real kind of strangeness of it. Like, there's a real odd vibe, and it's because it's not really a lot of the time it's not really instruments. I got a bit of inspiration out of Enon's Fallout stuff, how he has that kind of really janky sort of sound to some of the soundtracks. Yeah. So yeah, I kind of took a leaf out of his book for that kind of that sound. Well, you can basically just find the soundtrack on Spotify and YouTube Music and all that sort of stuff. The game itself is on Apple Arcade. If for anyone that has Apple products, it sucks for me. I've got an iPad that's too old to play it, and I have an Android that so it doesn't come out. I haven't been able to use it on that. But yeah, I'm just on Twitter at Brad Gentle, and thanks for all the shout outs over the years. I'm sure I've done less to deserve it than I have gained from it. But thanks.
Well, we're so grateful. I didn't even mention that you help us out with our website, and you've helped me out with a lot of other things in the past, and you'll be helping me out with some things in the future too.
For sure. It's been too long. COVID has had an effect on everyone, I think.
It has indeed, yeah. But yeah, thanks so much for chatting today. Really, really did enjoy the tunes, and always nice to get caught up.
Thank you, and thanks for doing this.
Thanks for listening to episode 147 of Level with Emily Reese. You can learn more about Brad Gentle at patreon.com/level. I'm Emily Reese. Sam Keenan is our producer. Say hi, Sam.
Hi.
You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Level with Emily, and learn more about us at levelwithemily.com, made possible by Adam Selvage at Tiki Web Services and composer Brad Gentle. Level with Emily Reese is a production of June Media, Inc.